Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for the launch of the UWA Public Policy Institute Sustainable Development Goals report. It's huge, packed full of good stuff. We'll get into it. My name is Bill Scanlon, partner here at EY. It's my great privilege to host you in our new home. We've been here since April. We love it. And ever since we've moved in, it's been my objective to show it off to as many people as possible. So, hitting that objective, thank you for coming and sharing in this new space. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Noongar Whadjuk, pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and the care that they have given to this land over tens of thousands of years. We, as you come in, I don't know if you would have seen it, but it's my ask of you when you go out and have a look. So as you're leaving, on your right, there's a beautiful wood carving of the double Jurgen, made by Dana Garlett and many of her friends and colleagues. And it tells the story of the traditional trade and activity that happened on Noongar Country, right here and around and on the other side of the river. And it has a beautiful sentiment. So to the Noongar people, trade was more than just exchange. Trade was the basis for reciprocity, sustainability, and strong relationships. And it's a beautiful piece of art, so please, when you go out, have a look. But I thought the sentiment that that piece of art expresses is perfect for the sentiment tonight, discussing UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it aligns with our purpose here at EY of building a better working world, and I'm as critical as the next person of corporate purpose statements, but I've been here 10 years and we've had that purpose statement, and I really love it. It resonates with me. Building a better working world is something we can never achieve, but it's always going to be our North Star, and it always is our North Star. And for me, it reminds me at least, that despite the fact we're here in WA in a small, very wealthy part of the globe, sort of corner of the globe, we're part of a wider world, and we need to keep that in our minds. So it sort of causes me to reflect that despite our great wealth, the Sustainable Development Goals are still relevant to our own communities right here in WA. And when you open this report, you'll see that one of the first Sustainable Development Goals is the eradication of poverty. And you'll see that there's work in here about what we need to do right here in WA, in an incredibly rich part of the world. So we've got work to do in our own backyard. But I think as a wealthy community, we also have work to do in the sharing of ideas and knowledge, so that other countries that are perhaps less well off than ours can benefit and can help them on their journeys towards sustainable development. So I think there's many people in this room that have contributed to this report, and many great sort of pieces of thinking that come out of WA and people in this room that I hope can be used and applied to in other countries that are less fortunate than ourselves. And indeed, I think you'll see in the report the topics are discussed around agricultural technology, health, well-being, quality of education, all coming from wonderful WA contributors. And I think that's fantastic. I did go back last night actually, and I went back and read the UN's 2015 text that accompanied the release of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it made me reflect, because a lot of the sentiment and the values that are accompanied the release of these goals, to be really honest, a few years ago I probably took them for granted almost as a given. But it's really interesting to go back now in the world that we live and have a look at what was put down on the page. I think a few of them are under really quite considerable threat, which actually makes conversations like these particularly pertinent. So at the risk of, I won't read too many, but things that jumped out at me: peace, dialogue, and international cooperation, front and centre when the UN released these And this one's a bit of a mouthful, but particularly relevant. A universal, rules-based, open, transparent, predictable, inclusive, non-discriminatory and equitable multilateral trading system. Yeah. Not what we have today. And for me as an economist, innovation and inclusive economic growth as drivers of productivity and the creation of good jobs. So my reflection is that we all have a part to play in the preservation of these sentiments and these values, and it's important that we have conversations like the one we're having tonight. So to all the report contributors, I wanted to say thank you. I haven't read it cover to cover, but I've had a flick through and it looks to be a really impressive piece of work. And it aligns brilliantly, I think, with my hope, and I think my colleague Adam's hope, that over the years this space becomes known as a space where we can share ideas, collaborate, discuss, learn together and grow together. So it's wonderful, this space, as I said at the outset, is new to us, and it's wonderful that we've got this opportunity with UWA, Paul and the team to launch this landmark report. Now, I was going to be introducing Richard, Chief Economist at the World Bank. I'm not sure if I am.
He's in DC. I'm hoping ICE haven't picked up for some reason. But I'm watching my phone to see if he's happening. So I think we're just going to pivot to the
so I'm going to introduce Paul. I'm going to introduce Paul. My God. Paul and I have a nasty habit of bumping into each other at random events. I think the first time I met Paul, it was probably in the context of well-being. And then I bumped into Paul in a discussion around defence and geopolitics, and I think we both looked at each other and said, "What are you doing here? Like, weren't you the well-being person?" And since then I've bumped into Paul at many different functions, and it just so happens that bumping into Paul at the UWA Club was the start of this event. So Paul, I'm not sure bumping into each other is sustainable, but it's been good today, and maybe we've got a development goal to work on to substantiate that and make it sustainable. I'll let you talk to your career, because it's okay. Illustrious and long, and I'll pass to you to introduce the panel. Okay. Thank you.
Hi everybody, and so my name is Paul McGinn. I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute, and just to give you a quick summary of what my research is about, it's about the 4 P's and the 4 S's: people, place, policy and politics, and the intersections of those 4 things. And then strategic planning, suburbs, the sex industry, and submarines. It's an amazing Venn diagram. I can make it work, okay? So I'm an urban planner, urban geographer by training, so the Sustainable Development Goals have been in my life since I started university back in 1987 as an undergraduate student at the University of Ulster. So, and for those who are old enough, you'll remember, of course, the Brundtland Report came out in 1987, and that's really the touchstone moment for sustainability emerging into mainstream policy discourses. Whether it's moved into mainstream public discourses, I think is very questionable. I'll just give you a little example of this. I was at an event in Lawson Flats a few weeks ago about AI and governance, and there was a guy there with the SDG pin, the whale, and I said to him, the SDGs. And he nearly fell over because I knew what that pin was about, and we got discussing. And his thing was, not a lot of people know about this in terms of the public, okay? So what we're trying to do, or the work that we do at the PPI, is about socializing, facilitating and promoting policy research and policy ideas, mainly led by UWA researchers and their collaborators, whether they're in-state, interstate or overseas, and trying to get this information and ideas out to wider publics, professional, general publics and policymakers as well. And this report is an example of this. It's written in an accessible format, short, snappy, so it's consumable, digestible for policymakers, because as academics, we all know that no policymaker will read an 8,000 word peer-reviewed paper. no offence. So we try to condense it down so it'll make sense and be accessible for you. So, I mean, on this report, it has been a long time in its kind of gestation, and I want to pay a big thanks to my colleague Ben Perks and Lucia Cronin, who have been kind of instrumental working with me and kind of pulling all this together in terms of getting the contributors, reviewing, editing, and designing the report as well. So thank you, Ben, and Lucia, you're up at the back of the room. Without you, this doesn't happen. So this evening is going to proceed like this. We're going to have a panel discussion. I'm going to lead it. I'm going to invite our panelists up in a second. And basically I've got a question for each of them in their areas of expertise. We've got a general question about the SDGs, and then I've got, I think, a couple of questions on the future direction of the SDGs. So the current SDGs run out in 2030, okay? So the MDGs were from 2000 to 2015, SDGs are 2015 to 2030. Whatever the next three-letter acronym is for, you know, the DGs, what is it, A or R? I was talking to some people earlier. I have R DGs, so real development goals, whatever that means. But the UN are gearing up. They're already having those discussions, and if you saw the 2025 review report, I think there are some signals in there about what they're going to focus on. And one of them, I think, is going to be a consolidation of the number of SDGs, and that's going to be probably one of the issues I'm really kind of interested in exploring with the panel. So let me introduce our STEAM panel. I'm just going to read in the order. And when I call your name out, if you can take a seat, that would be really helpful. So first we have Professor Karambakh Siddique from the University of Western Australia, Institute of Agriculture, and Karambakh is a global leader in agriculture, crop science, and food security. So welcome, Karambakh. Next we have Jessica Maywig, also from the University of Western Australia. She's a distinguished marine ecologist specialising in ocean protection and sustainable futures. Third is Associate Professor Fiona McGaughey, who's from the same part of the world as me. So we're taking over from Northern Ireland to the north of Ireland or Ulster, depending on where your political persuasion sit. So Fiona was in the law school, has recently become PVC of Academic Advancement and Equity. Diversity. And is an expert in human rights, law and global justice. Next we have Michael Sheldrake, who's co-founder of globalcitizen.org, a New York-based global international philanthropic organization, and a leading voice in global advocacy, mobilization and international cooperation. We had Michael do a public lecture for us just over a year ago now, Michael? March last year. Time's passed so quickly. And then finally, we have Adam Carroll, who's a partner here at EY and a specialist in corporate sustainability, ESG reporting, and organizational transformation. So that's our panel. Hopefully you can remember all their names. Okay, so just so you're aware, I'm not going to do a Q&A at the end. You can do the Q&A when we conclude the panel discussion, when we have refreshments again. So you can ask them all the tricky questions you want. You can build them up for their responses if you don't like them, or if you want to take them to task. Do it civilly and convivially after everything. Okay. So, and what a wonderful space to have that convivial conversation with people. So big thank you to Bill and Ella for helping us out and organising everything and inviting us into your work home, if I can call it that, basically. So I'm going to begin with, I'm going to explore kind of individual areas of your expertise. So let me just articulate myself a little bit so I can address you kind of full on a bit. So, Siddique, let me start with you first. Okay, so given rising climate variability, as an ag scientist, what innovations in crop science or farming systems do you see as most critical for achieving SDG 2, particularly in drought-prone regions? And I think that's important because we've just hit summer. We had a 39-degree day yesterday. I don't know what it hit today, but it felt certainly in the mid-30s. So What do you think, City?
Thank you, Paul, and thanks EY for hosting us. Hope you can hear me. I got a little bit of allergy. I've been in India for the last 10 days. Look, a couple of points I want to make. Australia is the driest human inhabited continent in the world, number one. So we have been drying, so we have been adapting. So 200 years ago, we haven't had any agriculture as we see today. So everything we have been bringing from elsewhere, and we have been adapting. That's through science and technology. Today, we are not one of the 4 countries in the world net food exporter. We used to be starving, remember? Every stuff has to, oh, this is beautiful.
So thank you again. I'll repeat that again. Australia is the driest human inhabited continent in the world. Number one point. And the climate has been changing, and of course, in recent years, anthropogenic, human-induced climate change is happening. So 200 years ago, we haven't had any food here. Of course, the Aboriginal community used whatever they can. And the migrants then had to wait for food to come from the motherland, and a lot of starvation and death. And from there, we are now the leading food exporting countries in the world, net food exporting countries in the world. So where we go next, there's no doubt that Western Australia, for example, 30% of the rainfall has been declining since 1975. Can you imagine a year like this year, 2025? The farmers were worried. There was no rain until end of May, June. If the same happened about 20 years ago, we would have had probably 5 to 6 million tons of grain. Today, we haven't finished the harvesting. We are predicting probably anything between 23 to 26 million tons of grain. How did we achieve that? So that's basically based on technology, new breeds, new varieties of wheat and all the crops, better decision making, clever farmers, of course, investment in research, development and extension over the years. Universities, Department of Primary Industries, the farmers and so on. So we have been able to cope up with the available and changing climate. But the question then is that if we don't attend the mitigation strategy, then we will be in trouble. There will be a tipping point. So Paul, I just wanted to very briefly say, the planetary health, one of the recent papers I just published in Nature, we set a 3-goal food system model. Number 1, environmental sustainability. Number 2, more importantly, soil health. And then the third is food security. We have listed different intervention strategies, but if I can just tell the point here, what we have to do is the integration of the 3 pillars. Pillar number 1, more food. Pillar number 2, healthier soils. And pillar number 3, listen to this carefully, fewer emissions. If you asked me 20 years ago or 10 years ago, come and give a talk, I would not have that pillar number 3. So within the triple goal, agri-food network, I can have various strategies. More food, I can have better varieties, I can use genetically modified CRISPR technology, I can use machine learning, AI, you name it. Healthy soil, we didn't know much about soil, we put the fertilizer and forget about it. A spoon of soil got more stars than you can see on a clear day with naked eye. That much microorganism. We don't know a lot of the function. We are really getting excited. We can harness those microbes and convert our soil into something which is useful. Emission, I don't need to teach EY, carbon dioxide conversion, nitrous oxide reduction, stable carbon pools in the soil, and of course the biological fixation. So in summary, basically we got a lot of knowledge around the place. I get a lot of times disappointed that we are not integrating. We are doing silo type of work. Students just focus only on their work, which they must. But they must learn what is going on. How can we integrate? So we have less and less integrators in the universities, in the research arena, in the business, etc. That's what we need. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Sadiq. I'll come back to integration later because I've got a question, a more general question. So, I'm going to move from land to ocean. So, Jessica, you're going to see a pattern here in my approach to this. So, we'll do people and systems in a little bit. Jessica, the contribution that you've got in the report looks at kind of industrial scale fishing issues. So, given the kind of, I suppose, the increasing industrial fishing pressures and new techniques of trawling the bottom of the ocean, for example, from your perspective and your colleagues' perspectives, what interventions do you think are most essential in trying to realise SDG 14, either here in Australia or the Indo-Pacific or globally? Easy question.
Yeah, no, it's in some ways it is an easy thing because we know what the solution is. But let me just start by saying that, asking the question, how many recreational fishers do I have in this audience? All right, some of you are lying. Because according to Recfish West, 80% of West Australians are recreational fishers. So the reality is that we're emptying the oceans. You know about empty forests, you drive through a forest, you hear no birds, right? That was the whole DDT crisis. But what we don't see is that we've also very effectively emptied our oceans since about 1950, post-World War II, when industrialized fishing took off. And the contribution to this report, led by Vanya Andrioli, soon to be Dr. Andrioli, who's here somewhere, was looking at subsidies and how governments subsidize their industrial fishing through fuel subsidies, through boat building subsidies, and so on. And the World Trade Organization just banned subsidizing illegal fishing. Just think about that for a minute. We have to ban subsidizing an illegal activity. And they're very proud of themselves for that. So what we talked about are how subsidies are a real problem because they basically allow people to continue fishing. And what we need to do is ban subsidies, not just to illegal fishing, but to legal fishing. Because what it does is it increases inequity between small coastal nations, developing nations, and other countries that are much more developed, like Spain and France and some of those countries. But the much easier solution, which we have 50 years of evidence for, is putting part of our oceans aside as marine parks, highly protected marine parks where there's no extraction, no fishing, no oil and gas, no seabed mining. We've got 50 years of evidence to show that these highly protected marine parks are the engine rooms of fisheries productivity. That's why fishermen fish the boundaries. And the obstacle to that is that governments lack boldness, but I just want to flag one other exciting bit in my field, which is the High Seas Treaty was just signed in September, and that will now give us a mechanism to place marine parks on the high seas. So there are solutions, we know that they work, and it's about being bold and pursuing them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think that boldness leads us into our next area. So we're going to focus on people and human rights. So we'll over to Fiona. I don't know,
okay.
Somebody else's phone. So Fiona, I mean, fundamentally the SDGs are about humans, whether we're the perpetrators of kind of the harms that we're doing to the environment on land, air, ocean, and so forth. But also how systems impact upon humans, groups, populations, and so forth. How well are human rights frameworks embedded in SDG implementation kind of strategies? And where do you think are the most critical gaps for marginalised communities?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think if we look at the list of SDGs, we can immediately see the parallels with human rights. And I don't know at the onset how much planning went into trying to link SDGs with human rights. You know, the UN is known not to have a very good linked up way of working, even among individual human rights bodies, never mind what they probably saw as another area of the UN. So certainly there are lots and lots of kind of parallels. I think that intersection is working in a few ways. So one example is the UN Human Rights Council. So the UN Human Rights Council was established in 2006, started to operate around 2008, and relatively speaking, it's quite a successful mechanism. So most people want to hear about how international law doesn't work. Well, I think it works a little bit, actually. Otherwise I wouldn't have a job, so I have to say that. But that system is basically a peer review process. So states come together and they review each other's performance in terms of human rights. And they quite like that because they're in control. Whereas other UN human rights bodies, such as the Human Rights Committee or the Committee on the Rights of the Child, you're assessed by a panel of independent experts, and they don't really like that so much. But the Human Rights Council, I just looked at it recently, and over the years, the recommendations that states are making to each other that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals is really on the increase. So I thought that was quite an interesting link, completely unrelated systems in lots of ways. But what it means is those diplomats and civil servants who go to the Human Rights Council on behalf of their states are making recommendations about human rights, but the kind of hook that they're using is the SDGs. So I think that's a really positive development. The other thing that happens, and I think it happens more probably outside of Western countries, is particularly low and middle income states, their understanding of human rights and their focus is often very aligned with the SDGs. So to kind of generalize, Western states are a bit more focused on civil and political rights and freedoms and things like that, and often low and middle income states are more focused on development, you know, basic needs in order to live: food, water, housing, education, healthcare, etc. And so some of those states are actually really using the SDGs framework to progress their international human rights law obligations. So one example that I've come across recently is Samoa. And Samoa has developed a kind of an online database and system called SADATA, and it is for the implementation in Samoa of human rights and the SDGs. So they don't see them as completely unrelated things. And the interesting thing about that initiative by Samoa is that in the region, lots of other states are now saying, oh, actually, we'd quite like to use that system as well. That's really good, including New Zealand. Because often we have this perception that the Western states develop all the great things and we give them to, you know, the global south, and that's not the case in this area. Actually, some of the really interesting initiatives have come from the global south. So I think both at the international level and then at national level, there is that really good connection between the SDGs and human rights. Probably it could be better, but there's definitely something there.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Michael, you're in the global advocacy mobilization space, so you work at that kind of meta level in terms of, you know, the policy arenas that you move around in and the actors that that you interact with. What's, from your perspective, I mean, and the colleagues that you work with, what strategies do you think can turn public awareness of the SDGs into real political action and financing? Because for me, one of the big issues about the SDGs is national governments are signatories to a non-binding treaty, and then it's the vertical integration from the national governments down, and the support architecture and mechanisms tend not to be there, particularly here in Australia. So, but can you give us an insight and maybe an example of good practice?
So, first of all, I should say thanks, Paul, for having me back, and thanks, EY, Bill, for having us here as well. You know, there was something you were talking about in your opening remarks that really resonated with me. When you were talking about the SDG pin, and you were saying that someone remarked, wow, you actually know what it was. And the reason why that resonated with me, and to your question, a decade ago, when the SDGs were gabbled in existence, literally the day that took place at the UN, I was part of this effort, literally with the ambition, with the goal, to make the SDGs famous. And we worked with a gentleman by the name of Richard Curtis. Some of you might know him. He was famous for producing such films as Four Weddings and a Funeral, Love Actually. In the UK, he had pioneered Red Nose Day, comic relief, and had great success. He came on board to lead this huge campaign with us. We had this huge festival. We had the likes of Beyonce, Pearl Jam, Coldplay. We had the business community there. We had
Nice name dropping.
I'm just showing you, the SDGs famous. There was a lot of people who resonated with this idea. We had Richard Branson, who mobilized the business sector, Bill Gates, Malala Yousafzai, Michelle Obama was there with a video message from Obama. Like, it was, to your point, Bill, it seemed like at the time, everyone was rallying around this agenda, at least in the elite space. And we thought we could make the goals famous, raise the awareness, and a movement would come into being that would hold leaders accountable for their delivery. And when we tracked the success of that year after year with the UN, the penetration of awareness of the SDG barely moved the dial. It was like, you're talking single digits, if anything, probably less than 1%, maybe 2% at its peak knew about the SDGs. And I think there were a couple of reasons for this. One is the 17 goals is just too hard. It's too hard to draft a call to action around that. And I still remember this meeting, you're talking about best practice. One of the best, I call them policy entrepreneurs, one of the best leaders I saw really drive a concerted agenda. Her name is Mia Motley. She's the Prime Minister of Barbados, so an island of 300,000 people, but she is on the list to be the next Secretary General of the UN. We'll see how she goes, but the reason why she's on this list, and if you want to be inspired, Google her name, watch one of her speeches, is because she knew how to drive an agenda. And I remember sitting at the UN, she had all the island member states together, and she said, we've got this one window. President Macron has agreed to convene this grouping together to drive a clear policy choice around what matters to us as small island nations. And she said, what should we fight for? And everyone started throwing up every issue under the sun. You know, taxing fossil fuel companies, levies, reparations, every issue you could imagine. And I just remember there was a moment in a meeting where she just put up her hand and she said, guys, she goes, come on. The moment we ask for everything at once, the game is up. We get to the end, we win by being focused and strategic. And in her case, she brought together this incredible coalition, 100,000 citizens, the likes of Greta Thunberg, all the way through to Billie Eilish and the likes of it, on this one culminating conference. And she managed to secure billions, potentially billions, in funding for countries like hers when they are hit by hurricanes. And that wasn't an academic exercise. When Jamaica was hit by a hurricane a few weeks ago, when last year Hurricane Beryl became the fastest growing, most intensive hurricane in the Caribbean and hit Grenada, the reforms that was passed meant that they had access to immediate financing as countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I've seen other examples, you know, in India, for instance, the intense focus on sanitation over the last decade saw actually incredible declines in child mortality. In South Africa, where I just came from, I witnessed incredible advocates bring together this incredible coalition in the townships of South Africa, often out of sight, out of mind, and because of their efforts, something like 4.3 million girls are potentially in school today, which just 7 years ago might have had to drop out. And I think the lesson here is, you know, I still remember when we tried to crunch this down, and what we took from this is we actually banned the phrase awareness raising. We said we're an advocacy organization. Action is our currency. We need to leave people with one thing, one action that they can do. I still remember when we pivoted and I tried to take the SDGs and say, well, where's the opportunity? I still remember, and I love the UN, by the way. I have immense respect for the UN, but I still remember one of the chief of communications of the UN basically thinking that we had committed an act of blasphemy because we weren't mentioning all 17 goals on this thing, and he said, where are all the goals? And I think it was Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist, who said, in the last few years, and it was almost funny, because when you were reading out that description of what was said, several of us chuckled, because there was a spirit of it, but it was such a long sentence. We had to chuck in another word, and he calls it everything bagalism. And we keep on adding, until the whole thing crashes under its weight. The good news is that in the remaining 5 years, there's a number of these areas, be it ocean, be it food security, which are force multipliers, where you can take the lessons, you could still accelerate incredible progress, and that would have a tremendous impact on some of the other SDGs. And it's not dependent on one country at all, including business and others can get behind it. So to me, that's the exciting upside of this.
Thanks, Michael. So you've ended there with business. You mentioned policy entrepreneurs earlier on. So this nice segue to Adam. Okay, so Adam, you're in the corporate sustainability space. You do a lot of work with, obviously, the private sector. How engaged is the private sector in the SDGs, and what does corporate SDG look like? Because we often think that the SDGs are really a government responsibility, but I mean ultimately the goals are about all of our responsibilities. But in a sectoral term, where does the private sector sit in this? How's its embrace of SDGs?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. But because Michael did, I'm going to start, however, with a band name drop apology, which is that tonight I'm going to go and see the greatest rock band in history, which needs no explanation, but it's a band called Tool. You may have heard of them. They're playing up the road. This is far more important than Tool, but my friend is unable to transfer me the ticket, and he's beside himself panicking, saying, you need to come with me to enter this concert soon. So if I'm not here at the very end, Bill, to answer any questions, that's why I'm rushing out the door to go to Tool. Can I give you a question? And I might, in answering it, I don't think contradict your remarks, Michael, but give a different take on them, which is that if you pick up any corporate sustainability report these days, you flick to the back page, you'll generally see the 17 SDGs in some form and some attempt to kind of map a company's sustainability strategy to those goals. So at face value, that might seem as though the corporate sector is substantively engaged with them. But in reality, I think the corporate sector has almost completely disengaged with the idea of sustainable development as enshrined in Agenda 21 and the Brundtland Report, which you mentioned earlier. And I think in this kind of genuine moment of crisis for corporate sustainability, there's no way back to legitimacy without re-engaging with the SDGs in all their glory. And I completely hear you when you say that if you go for the everything label, nothing gets done. But I think one of the issues that we have to deal with in corporate sustainability, and this is a controversial thing to say, particularly in light of Bill Gates's completely misfired missive on the unnecessary, tension between climate and poverty, is that sustainable development or corporate sustainability has become too climate-centric in my view. And let me quickly preface that by saying climate change is the most existential crisis the world faces, and that we need to address it with the utmost priority. But I think in climate change, the corporate sustainability community thought it found a shortcut to mass action. It thought that it had this great unifying risk that would galvanise everyone together, and it thought that it could avoid the hard work of having to engage with people's sense of kind of meaning or empathy or morality, and speak just to the idea of survival and existential risk. And that strategy was worth a go, but I think what's happened, however, is that we now have ceased to really engage with the idea of the relativity of human experience and the preservation of poverty. We no longer really talk about the quality of life, we just talk about the quantity of life. If you talk about the sustainability industry, we largely now describe our beneficiaries as future generations. That's all we always say, future generations. And we've sort of lost touch with the lived experience of existing generations. And I think that's a fundamental anchor on the capacity of corporate sustainability to kind of to kind of galvanise that you know, we no longer talk about the idea of poverty. We no longer talk about the idea that we should attempt to eradicate poverty everywhere all at once. We tend to think that we're either doomed or we're going to succeed premised upon the idea of climate change alone, and that until we actually re-engage with some of the other 17, not necessarily en masse at the same time, I think we're going to be locked in this concept of extinction. Because if you talk about extinction, as we tend to in this climate space, it sort of rolls up all of humanity into one bucket. And in your report, which is excellent, and I commend you for it, I think one of the statistics in there is that over 1 million children die every year as a consequence of of unsafe drinking water. I think that I saw that in there. No one in the corporate sustainability space would be familiar with that statistic, and I think, yeah. So until we reassert the primacy of poverty and the primacy of inequality and the lived experience of current generations, we won't actually have the kind of moral or political capital to be able to drive the level of structural change required to achieve climate change. So in quick summary, look, I don't disagree with everything you said at all, but I think we have to re-engage with the kind of the fact that in a way we can't pick and choose the kind of moral order of existential crises, and if we were to, you start with poverty and then you start to rectify issues after that. Otherwise, I don't feel like we've got a way back to being a genuine movement for change.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Our report kind of offers a more, well, it takes a critical view on the SDGs and where where the problems and issues are, but fundamentally we're trying to look forward with a positive light. What are ideas to move forward, and look, I would concur with you in terms of that that present and future orientation. Because focusing on the future is, we're not there yet, so we can't deal with that per se. We do have to deal with the kind of here and now, and that does, I think that sets us up for what might come tomorrow and beyond that and stuff. So thinking about that kind of positive framework here, this is a general question from across the board. So I'm going to put you on the spot, all on a spot a little bit. I was going to ask you what is the biggest obstacle preventing meaningful SDG progress, but I want to explore positives. So I'm going to ask you the second part of this question is, what do you think is the one realistic intervention that could assist us shift the global trajectory on the SDGs as we approach 2030? So just what is the one big idea that you might put forward? So I don't know who would like to go first. And something concrete that we can...
The other part of the question, the first part.
The problems?
Yes, that's what I prepped for.
Okay. Well, you can deal with the problem. When it comes to you can say the problem, and then we can figure out what the solution is.
I think it's going to be not one single bullet, but let me ask a question. Is it still feasible for 2050 to achieve the SDG? That's the question I keep on asking, particularly almost 8 SDGs which I'm interested in relation to food, hunger, malnutrition, etc. We still got 768 million people go hungry every day. Again, it's a complex one, I won't go into the details. So the answer to me is that yes, but urgent action is needed. So when we look at the several drivers, unlikely high population still going on, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Asian countries, high westernization as a food habit, high food waste and losses, 30% of the food is wasted, high climate change and high land degradation. So, through which response I have just jotted here, combine agriculture efficiency, demand side and nature-based solutions. So the next question I ask myself, what could be the implication for contrasted world regions? We're not talking about one world, it's different regions. So again, I use the term convergence across world regions. That is example in diets, needed to reach SDG targets, also at a regional scale. So in summary, integrating, again I use the word integrating and innovation quite a lot, global targets with country-specific scenarios. and local initiative. This is so important. We heard about lack of drinking water or sanitation, and again, lack of diversity in food. For example, we are not eating diverse food basket, which is leading to obesity, which is again an issue, hidden hunger in other parts of the world. So both national, international goals for food system transformation is required from my perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Sadiq. Michael, I think this is really a kind of space that you're in, because you
Yeah.
this advocacy, positive movement going forward.
So I
from
think-
your perspective.
Yeah, and to bridge from the previous conversation, because I agree with you, and I guess what I want to avoid is a situation in which you try and inspire people, and this is where I think we failed 10 years ago by inspiring people with a scorecard checklist approach. And it's like, how do you make the SDGs valuable? How do you make them resonate with people, and then how do you zero in on that? And actually I agree with you on poverty, and that's why we said, well, okay, if we're a movement of global citizens, we actually put, and I think it's good that poverty is number one, and we said, okay, how do we make that as our core, and everything else? If you can eradicate extreme poverty, you can address these other issues in a sustainable way. So we currently have 12.5 million citizens around the globe, 70% of which are under the age of 24. And of that, it's quite geographically dispersed, but about 25% of all of our citizens who took action over the last year were actually in Africa. And we went out to these young populations and we said, well, what do the SDGs mean to you? What does it mean to you when we say all of these words? What resonates the most? And you know what they all asked for? At the end of the day, it boiled down to livelihoods. It boiled down to jobs. It boiled down to actually having the means to lift your communities out of poverty so that you could have agency on all of these other issues. And one of the exciting things right now is we've really identified, well, where could be the drivers of job creation on, say, the continent of Africa. And when you look at South Africa alone, 60% of the people, young people under the age of 24, are unemployed. You throw in challenges like AI, it's easy to feel very doom and gloomy about the prospects of being able to create jobs for the next generation. But one of the emerging areas that we've spent a lot of time unpacking is tourism, the creative industry, film and music as a job creator. Now, RJ Banger at the World Bank, and if our economist friend joins, he might be able to validate this, but he says for every dollar you invest in tourism, film, music, creative industries, you create 8 more jobs than that invested in traditional drivers of poverty alleviation like manufacturing. And I've seen this firsthand. I've seen this in Rwanda, where they took a bet on training young people. You know, you're talking about rigging, which if any of you go to the arena here or stadium, you see that. They will tell you that rigging is one of the most dangerous, highly specialized job qualifications when it comes to having events. But because they got the highest international certification, their arena, now they're doubling the size of that from 20,000 to 40,000 people, it's now basically booked out throughout the year and attracting job after job. Other cities across Africa emulating this. And this is a continent which, for the 3rd year running, has been the fastest growing region in the world when it comes from revenues from music, right? And some of the biggest artists on the planet right now, in terms of those resonating with young people, are from Africa. And then you look at other industries there, you know, I think they say energy, they say pharmaceutical, medical research, they say live events, creative industry. These are the industries of the future where you support them. But on the hopeful part, I just came from the Western Cape in South Africa. And I was at this training academy where they were training these young guys as solar technicians. And these 2 young men, Keanu and Luke were their names. And I asked them what they were going to do once they leave this academy, because, you know, when you look at 60% unemployment, would they even be able to get a job? So I asked them what their plan was. And he said, you know what, we're going to start our own business. We're going to do rooftop solar. They actually referenced Perth. I said, we've been looking at Perth as a case study. They said, we're going to talk to the households, convince them that this will lead them to lower household bills within the next 5 years. So, okay, that's a pretty big ambition. What are you trying to do? They said, we're trying to get $10,000 in startup capital. And then they said, okay, once we've done that, we're not done. We have the best places in the world, alongside WA, for solar. We're going to convince the tech companies to invest in their data centers here, and then we're going to build the solar panels for it. And then I said, okay, well, that's pretty ambitious. And then on the way up, he said, then we're going to go to space and build the solar panels to bring humanity to space. But for me, that was the ambition. These young guys, 20 years old, and I was like, wow, when people talk about the renewable, when they talk about that space, this is the front lines of that. And to me, if we can address unemployment, if we can address job creation, give people the means, it will take the tension out. It's not to say we don't focus on all of these things. My point is we need to connect the SDGs and we need to show it resonates. And you know what? There's a recent poll from the Rockefeller Foundation, international corporation, one of those words you mentioned, 3/4 of the planet, including in the United States, but still believe in it. They believe in the idea of solidarity, provided you can show how it meets their basic needs and how it improves them. And so that's something I'm interested in, but I think that's a formula that can turn apathy into agency.
Thanks, Michael. So you mentioned Richard. When my phone went off earlier, that was Richard. So he has not been detained by ICE. So I'm going to pivot it after this conclusion. We're going to bring Richard in because he's in DC and he's up early, and I don't want to miss the chance of inviting him in to the conversation to officially launch the report. So, Adam, quickly.
Let me be super quick then.
Yeah. You've got to go to 2.
Yeah, exactly. But also, look, no, I think one of the issues that impacted the support of the SDGs and the MDGs is they were born into a time in which the world was kind of suspicious of grand narratives and ideology and big ideas. And fortunately, I think that has changed now. I think there's a hunger for big ideas out there these days that the SDGs can speak to. There's sustainable development, it almost, people say it needs a new name because it really doesn't do justice to the romance and beauty of what it stands for. It's a remarkably beautiful concept born at a point in history where humanity was looking for its next thing to do, and it's about giving justice to the beauty of conscious life by living it better than we found it. I feel as though there's never been a world that's more receptive to the idea of big ideas and a degree of utopianism than now. No other grand socio-political narrative is offering anything. We've got these kind of reductive, backward-looking promises to rediscover a sort of fictionalized past is what a lot of the big ideas offer. Sustainable development offers a way to kind of turn the page, to kind of evolve, to move on, to kind of escape the doom loop of history, repeat it, and do something grander and better or more beautiful. And I think actually it will fall on more welcome ears now than I think any other point in history.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Jessica.
So I get asked all the time, why don't you work on climate? And I have 2 answers for that. One is because there's lots of people doing that. But the second one is I think we need wins. And I think we need things that don't seem so difficult and all-encompassing. And so the reason I work on marine parks is because that's actually, that's actually buying time. It's building resilience so that we can get to solving some of those really wicked problems. And I think we get so overwhelmed by, what are you supposed to do? What fish can you eat? What are all the bad things we shouldn't be doing? And I think getting some wins and focusing on really simple things. And I will tell my joke, because I think actually the communication side is a big part of it. So we've got 2 kinds of marine parks in Australia. So do you think you can fish in marine parks in Australia? Trawl, mine for oil and gas? Yes, you can. We've got a few highly protected areas which are proper parks. And then we've got all these other partially protected areas. Now, when did your sex ed teacher ever tell you that partial protection worked? So trying to find those solutions that we know work, trying to find the language to talk to politicians, and I embarrassed the Minister for Environment, federal one, by telling that joke in Parliament. Over drinks, I'll tell you the corollary of that. But anyway, so I think it's finding some solutions and clear wins and learning how to communicate them. The science is in, we don't need to do more science, except for mine.
Spoken like a true academic.
No, we
Fiona,
can't do more.
but we're going to end with you, Fiona. Big chance to shine for
I've got
the
no
North of
jokes
Ireland
whatsoever. So yeah, so in the piece that we wrote for the report, myself and my co-authors, and one of them is here this evening, Dr. Dominic de Whadjuk. I don't know if he's there somewhere. Yes, thank you, Dominic. We specifically looked at SDG 8.7 and the eradication of forced labour and trafficking and exploitation through child labour. And I think where I see a lot of potential goes to some of Adam's point. I think the private sector could play a much, much bigger role. I think traditionally we've looked to governments and to states and we've placed all of the responsibility there, and actually large multinational corporations are a lot more wealthy than many countries. And I think we're starting to see a lot more responsibility being placed on the private sector. And in our area of work, as Dom and I looked at, you know, it started off with a fairly light touch in Australia around modern slavery reporting. But I think the positive of an initiative like that is it does make corporates think beyond their own employees and their own experience, and to kind of go beyond in terms of psychological distance and look at, you know, the supply chains that they're using overseas in high-risk countries, etc. And of course, we've now got mandatory climate reporting. And there's one thing I've really noticed is, in terms of, we've talked about action, nothing speeds up action more than a little bit of compliance. Oh, we have to do this for compliance reasons, oh dear. You know, the gender equity pay gap reporting, suddenly we're seeing progress on the gender pay gap, which we haven't seen for decades. So I think the potential is there to use laws within each country and internationally to put more obligations on the private sector to start to chip away at some of these things. Europe is really leading the way in terms of human rights due diligence laws and human rights and environmental due diligence laws, and corporations, both of those sort of positive duties to take action, but also they're being held to account where they have caused harms to communities, particularly where they're working and have supply chains overseas. So that's the area where I think we could see a lot more progress.
Okay, thanks Fiona. So look, I'm going to draw the panel discussion to a close now that we have Richard on our side. So if I could ask the panelists to please take their seats, and then we're going to pivot by the power of technology. We're going to zip to Washington DC. So Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So,
Good evening.
Morning to you, Richard. I'm just going to do a quick introduction, and then if you can do the official proceedings to launch our report, that would be fantastic. So this is Dr. Richard Damania, who's the Chief Economist at the World Bank, and Richard's in the Sustainable Development Practice Group. So many thanks, Richard, for joining us from DC. I know it's cold there and it's early. It's very warm here, and we have the most amazing view as we're looking up at here. The sun has just set behind your head. So over to you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for inviting me. And gosh, do I envy you being in Australia, and envy you even more being in Perth. I wish I could have joined you in person. But enough of that. It's a real privilege to be here with you for this launch. Now, the SDGs and this volume are really important. They remind us what is at stake, and importantly, what can be done. And of course, at the heart of all of this are the SDGs. And may I urge you to look at the SDGs not merely as a statistic or a checklist, but in fact as a vision, and a vision that we really need in today's world that is fragmenting. A vision of prosperity that does not come at the expense of the planet, a vision of prosperity that is shared equitably, and prosperity that endures across generations. Now, if truth be told, if we are going to achieve the SDGs, we really have to shift quite radically the way in which we manage a lot in society, and especially a lot in the economy. Now, for centuries, economic growth has always implicitly and explicitly relied upon nature's bounty. For instance, for generations, forever, soils have determined agricultural productivity and fed civilizations. Without water, we can't live. Water sustains life, and yet it is growing scarce. forests gave way for space, and of course immense materials. But we as humans have been ingenious in using these gifts of nature, and we've made extraordinary progress. There's much more to be done, but we've made progress. Let me highlight just 3 critical areas. Extreme poverty. That's people living in about $2 or $3 a day. You know, 40 years ago, extreme poverty was almost at 50%. So 1 in 2 people you would have met would have been in extreme poverty. Today, that number is down to 8.6%. That is enormous progress. That is really, really good. Of course, we'd like it to be 0, but it's great that poverty has come from almost 50% down to under 10%. Food scarcity, we worry about food security, quite rightly. But did you know the world produces 3,000 kilocalories per person per day? That's more than enough to feed everyone. If anyone goes hungry, it's because of affordability and access to food, not because we don't produce too much. And electricity and clean water, once we thought of them as luxuries, now the SDGs tell us they're necessities, and of course we all agree that they are. But this enormous progress that we've made, and we need to make much more progress, as this volume tells us, has come at the cost of the planet. And we are pushing the planet to its very limits. Climate change is an issue that everyone knows and talks about, but there's other planetary limits on water, on air, on forests, on biodiversity, and so on. And we have always assumed in the world of development, and especially economics, that nature's gifts and assets are endless. In fact, most economic models treat nature as abundant, expendable, or unimportant. Effectively, it's not in most economic models. But of course, we know this is inaccurate, especially today. Why is it inaccurate, even if you took a very narrow economic perspective? Let me give you a bunch of statistics that I'm sure no one has really seen, but they've been there for us to see for a very long time. Did you know today, 9 out of 10 people, that's 90% of the population of the world, live with either degraded land, or unsafe air, or water stress? That's 90% of the people endure one of these 3 problems: bad land, or bad air, or bad water. Now flip your attention to low-income countries. In low-income countries, 80% of people endure all 3: bad land, bad air, bad water. Now, it's common sense, and it's very, very clear that you cannot develop your economy, you cannot grow adequately if your people are sick because of bad air and bad water, or if your agriculture is unproductive. So these are not ecological luxuries. They're the foundations of economic progress. And yet, consistently, in economic discourse, we ignore these issues. And that is why I think this book is immensely important. It reminds us, as we all know, that society, the environment, and the economy are deeply intertwined. And what this volume does is it gathers these threads across from various disciplines, continents, and sectors, provides us with some really, really good examples of what needs to be done and what remains to be done. And in these challenging times, I'd suggest this volume is proof of the value that universities can bring, and especially what UWA brings. It brings us in this volume knowledge that is practical, knowledge that's accessible, very, very well written, and of course that's actionable. It draws from real-world experiences. And that is exactly some of the research that we want from universities. So to sum up, I would say that the SDGs are about sustainability, and they remind us that sustainability is not about a sacrifice, but what it is about is an opportunity and an enhancing well-being. With that, let me thank you, and let me apologize for being late, and I hope you've had a wonderful launch. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Richard, and you and I have been chatting over the last few months, and if you make it down to Perth, you're always welcome at the Public Policy Institute, so I hope to see you here soon. because I know you have a connection with Adelaide, and you know, and your connection with Australia is strong. So hopefully someday we'll meet in person. So many thanks once again for writing this forward and for launching the report.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I'm just going to invite Bill back just to close proceedings, and then we'll move to networking and socialising. So Bill.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Richard. Thank you all. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I found that myself very informative and inspiring. I must say I was reflecting through the conversations. I didn't sort of explain at the outset my role at EY. So I lead an infrastructure practice and I also lead our government practice. And that typically gets us involved in the thinking that goes before big decisions, big investment decisions. Governments, organisations come to us and they say, we've got this idea, we need a business case, we need an EY business case. This is going to be great, there's going to be benefits, this is going to be fantastic. In all sorts of sectors. And then often they say, oh, it's got to align with those SDG things, you know. And I take comfort from the conversation that they are a great concept. They do need perhaps a little bit more selling, and we in this room can start to sell those that are selling being a horrible word. Promote, advocate, I'm trying to think of your words, Michael. But I'm glad I'm not the only one, and I'll take from this conversation a greater onus to really make sure that my clients, if they are claiming to align with SDGs, that they do it properly and with rigour and substance. So that was my reflection. I loved Richard's comments about not a checklist but a vision for prosperity, and I think it worked lovely. Richard was going to go first. It actually worked brilliantly. Richard came last. So Paul and the UWA team and Ben, thank you so much to the panellists. Thank you all so much. There's more jokes to be told. I understand. For those of you not going to Tool, I didn't get an invite. Talk to Adam about that tomorrow. But yes, look, please stay on. I'm really glad you could make it out tonight and be part of this. I hope you've got something out of it. And let's have a drink and a chat, and you can quiz the panellists in further detail. Thank you all very much.